The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre Oriental like ghostly fingers, concealing what would become one of the most audacious military maneuvers in American history. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna stood atop the rocky fortress of Cerro Gordo, his weathered hands gripping the stone battlements as he surveyed the narrow mountain pass below. It was April 17, 1847. And the Mexican commander believed he had chosen the perfect killing ground. "They will come like lambs to slaughter," Santa Anna muttered to his aide-de-camp, Colonel Jose Maria Herrero. The Mexican general's confidence was not misplaced. Cerro Gordo rose nearly 1,000 feet above the national road that wound through the treacherous mountain pass, creating a natural choke point that had served as a strategic position for centuries. Ancient Aztec warriors had once used these same heights to ambush Spanish conquistadors, and now Santa Anna intended to employ similar tactics against the advancing American army. The fortress-like mountain was honeycombed with carefully positioned artillery batteries, each cannon strategically placed to rain death upon anyone foolish enough to attempt passage through the narrow defile below. 3,000 Mexican soldiers occupied the heights, their muskets gleaming in the early morning sun. Santa Anna had transformed Cerro Gordo into what he believed was an impregnable stronghold, a mountainous Gibraltar that would stop the American advance cold and perhaps turn the tide of the entire war. Down in the valley, the dust clouds of the approaching American army grew larger with each passing hour. Major General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of American forces in Mexico, had been pushing his men hard since landing at Veracruz nearly a month earlier. The coastal campaign had been a masterpiece of military engineering and tactical brilliance, but now Scott faced his greatest challenge yet. The road to Mexico City led directly through this mountain pass, and there was no way around it. Scott's army consisted of approximately 8,500 men, battle-tested veterans who had proven themselves in the initial landings and subsequent coastal operations. Among them marched future Civil War legends, Captain Robert Edward Lee of the Corps of Engineers, Lieutenant Ulysses Simpson Grant of the 4th Infantry, and Lieutenant Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who would one day earn the nickname Stonewall. These young officers, still learning their craft, would witness firsthand the kind of bold strategic thinking that would influence their own military careers in the decades to come. As reported in contemporary accounts from the New York Herald's battlefield correspondence, the American reconnaissance had initially suggested that Cerro Gordo was indeed impregnable from a frontal assault. The main road passed directly beneath the Mexican guns, creating what military tacticians called an enfilade, where attacking forces would be subjected to devastating crossfire from multiple positions. Any conventional assault up the steep slopes would result in catastrophic casualties, perhaps enough to cripple Scott's entire campaign. But Winfield Scott had not earned his reputation as old fuss and feathers through conventional thinking. The 61-year-old general had spent decades studying European military theory and had developed an appreciation for the kind of audacious flanking maneuvers that had made Napoleon Bonaparte famous. As his army made camp in the valley below, Cerro Gordo, Scott was already formulating a plan that would demonstrate American military innovation at its finest. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through military academies for generations to come. A battle where tactical brilliance would triumph over natural advantages, and where young American officers would learn lessons they would carry into their own moments of destiny. Captain Robert Edward Lee crouched behind a massive boulder, his engineer's eye carefully studying the seemingly impossible terrain that stretched before him. The 29-year-old Virginian had volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission, finding an alternative route around the Mexican stronghold that could allow American forces to outflank Santa Anna's position. For 2 days, Lee had been crawling through thorny underbrush, scaling rocky precipices, and mapping every gully and ridge on the northern face of Cerro Gordo. The reconnaissance mission had been born from desperation. General Scott's initial probes of the Mexican defenses had confirmed his worst fears. A direct assault would be tantamount to murder. The narrow road provided no room for maneuver, and the steep slopes offered little cover for attacking infantry. Mexican artillery commanded every approach, and Santa Anna's engineers had spent weeks perfecting their defensive positions. Something extraordinary would be required to crack this mountain fortress. Lee's keen military mind, however, had spotted what others had missed. During his third night of reconnaissance, he had discovered a narrow deer trail that wound around the northern slope of the mountain, invisible from the Mexican positions, but potentially passable for determined soldiers. The path was treacherous, requiring men to move in single file while clinging to rocky outcroppings, but it led to a small plateau behind the main Mexican defensive line. "It can be done," Lee reported to General Scott upon his return, his uniform torn and his hands bloodied from 3 days of climbing. "The trail is narrow and dangerous, but a determined force could reach the Mexican rear without being detected. We could place artillery on the plateau and take their main positions from behind." Scott studied Lee's hastily drawn map with growing excitement. The young engineer had found the key to unlocking Santa Anna's fortress, but executing the plan would require perfect timing and extraordinary courage from the men involved. The flanking force would need to move through complete darkness, carrying their equipment up treacherous mountain paths while maintaining absolute silence. A single mistake, one stumble or cough at the wrong moment, would alert the Mexican sentries and doom the entire operation. The plan that emerged from Scott's headquarters tent was breathtakingly audacious. While a diversionary force under Brigadier General David Emanuel Twiggs would demonstrate against the Mexican front lines, the main assault would be delivered by a flanking column led by Brigadier General Gideon Johnson Pillow. This force would include the cream of Scott's army: the 2nd Artillery under Colonel William Jenkins Worth, the 3rd Infantry under Colonel James Smith McIntosh, and a battalion of riflemen under Major William Wallace Smith Bliss. Contemporary military dispatches, as preserved in the National Archives, reveal the meticulous planning that went into every aspect of the operation. Supply trains were organized to carry disassembled artillery pieces up the mountain paths. Engineers calculated the exact angles needed for the guns to be effective once they reached the plateau. Medical corpsmen prepared for the inevitable casualties that would result from moving large numbers of men across such treacherous terrain in darkness. Lieutenant Ulysses Simpson Grant, serving with the 4th Infantry, later wrote in his memoirs about the electric atmosphere in the American camp on the evening of April 17th. Veterans who had fought in numerous Indian wars spoke in hushed tones about the audacity of the planned assault. Young soldiers, many experiencing their first major battle, wrote letters home that they feared might be their last. The entire army understood that they were about to attempt something unprecedented in American military history. As darkness fell over the Sierra Madre Oriental, the flanking columns began their movement. Moving like shadows through the Mexican night, hundreds of American soldiers began the most dangerous march of their lives, carrying the hopes of their nation on their shoulders as they climbed toward destiny. The darkness was absolute. Lieutenant Thomas Jonathan Jackson pressed himself against the cold stone of the mountain face, listening intently for any sound that might indicate Mexican sentries had detected their movement. Behind him, a column of 2,000 American soldiers snaked silently up the treacherous deer path that Captain Lee had discovered, each man placing his feet exactly where the soldier ahead had stepped. The night march had begun at 10 o'clock. With Brigadier General Pillow personally leading the advance guard. The men had been ordered to remove anything that might create noise. Canteens were wrapped in cloth, bayonet scabbards were secured with leather straps, and even boot buckles had been muffled with strips of canvas. The slightest sound could alert Mexican pickets and turn their secret approach into a death trap. Moving in single file up the narrow mountain path proved even more challenging than Lee's reconnaissance had suggested. The trail frequently disappeared entirely, forcing the column to halt while engineers felt their way forward in the darkness, searching for handholds and footholds that could support the weight of armed men. Several times, soldiers lost their footing and nearly plummeted into the rocky ravines below, saved only by the quick reactions of their comrades. The most difficult challenge was moving the artillery. 6 12-pound cannons had been disassembled and distributed among the climbing soldiers, with each gun barrel requiring 8 men to carry it safely up the mountain. The bronze cannons weighed nearly 2,000 pounds each, and maneuvering them up the steep inclines required extraordinary coordination and strength. Teams of soldiers worked in shifts, passing the heavy gun components from man to man like a primitive assembly line stretched across the mountainside. Sergeant Major William Brown of the 2nd Artillery later described the ascent as the most physically demanding night of my military career. The veteran soldier who had served in the War of 1812 found himself questioning whether the human body could endure such punishment. Men collapsed from exhaustion and had to be helped to their feet by their comrades. Water became precious beyond measure as the climbing soldiers sweated profusely despite the cool mountain air. According to contemporary accounts preserved in regimental histories, the most terrifying moment came when the lead elements of the column encountered a Mexican patrol around 2 o'clock in the morning. 3 enemy soldiers, probably deserters attempting to flee Santa Anna's army, stumbled directly into the American advance guard while navigating the same mountain paths. For a heart-stopping moment, both groups stared at each other in mutual shock and recognition. Major Bliss, commanding the lead company, made a split-second decision that probably saved the entire operation. Rather than allowing his men to fire and alert the entire Mexican army, he ordered a silent bayonet charge. The brief, vicious struggle was over in seconds, with the Mexican soldiers overwhelmed and killed before they could raise an alarm. The bodies were quickly hidden among the rocks, and the column continued its ascent as if nothing had happened. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the exhausted Americans had reached the plateau that Lee had identified during his reconnaissance. The position offered a commanding view of the rear of the Mexican defenses, exactly as the young engineer had promised. Santa Anna's artillery was positioned to defend against attacks from the valley below, leaving their rear approaches completely unguarded. The Mexican commander's confidence in the natural strength of his position had blinded him to the possibility of such an audacious flanking maneuver. As dawn began to break over the Sierra Madre Oriental, American engineers worked frantically to reassemble their artillery pieces. The success of the entire operation now depended on getting those cannons into firing position before the Mexican army realized what was happening. The race against time had begun, and the fate of Scott's entire campaign hung in the balance. The first rays of sunlight painted the mountain peaks gold as General Santa Anna emerged from his command tent, confident that another day would pass, with the Americans remaining trapped in the valley below. The Mexican commander had spent a comfortable night reviewing his defensive positions, satisfied that Cerro Gordo remained impregnable. His artillery commanded every approach, his infantry occupied prepared positions along the ridge lines, and the narrow mountain pass offered no room for enemy maneuver. What Santa Anna did not know was that 2,000 American soldiers now occupied the plateau behind his main defensive line, frantically working to position their cannons for a devastating surprise attack. The assembly of the artillery pieces had proceeded with desperate efficiency throughout the pre-dawn hours. American engineers, working by feel in the darkness, had managed to reassemble 4 of their 6 cannons before the sun rose high enough to risk detection by Mexican lookouts. Colonel Worth positioned his guns with the precision of a master chess player, each cannon carefully sighted to deliver enfilade fire along the Mexican trenches. The 12-pound cannons, once positioned on the plateau, could rake the entire length of Santa Anna's defensive line from behind, turning the Mexican soldiers' own fortifications against them. What had been protective earthworks would become death traps once the American artillery opened fire from the unexpected direction. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, General Scott's diversionary attack commenced in the valley below. Brigadier General Twiggs led his division in a spirited demonstration against the Mexican front lines, drawing Santa Anna's attention away from the mountains behind his position. Mexican artillery responded immediately, filling the morning air, with the thunder of cannon fire as the defenders engaged what they believed was the main American assault. The deception worked perfectly. Santa Anna rushed to his forward observation post, personally directing the defensive fire against Twiggs' attacking columns. Mexican officers focused their telescopes on the valley floor, watching American soldiers advance and retreat in what appeared to be a conventional assault against prepared positions. None of the defending commanders thought to look behind them, where American artillerists were making final preparations for their surprise attack. Lieutenant Grant, positioned with the diversionary force, later wrote about the surreal experience of participating in a battle that was essentially theatrical. The 4th Infantry advanced to within musket range of the Mexican positions, exchanging volleys with enemy infantry while carefully avoiding any action that might compromise the main assault. It was warfare as performance art, designed to hold Santa Anna's attention while the real attack developed elsewhere. As documented in official Army reports filed with the War Department, the coordination required for such a complex operation tested American military communications to their limits. Signal flags, barely visible in the morning mist, carried messages between the various assault columns. Timing was crucial. If the flanking attack commenced too early, the diversionary force would be caught in an exposed position. If it began too late, Mexican scouts might discover the American artillery on the plateau. At 7:15, Colonel Worth raised his sword and brought it down in a sharp cutting motion. 4 American cannons roared simultaneously, their iron shot tearing through the ranks of surprised Mexican soldiers who had been facing the wrong direction. The sound of the guns echoing off the mountain walls created a thunderous reverberance that seemed to shake the entire Sierra Madre Oriental. Mexican soldiers spun around in confusion, unable to comprehend how enemy artillery had appeared behind their supposedly impregnable defenses. The psychological impact of the surprise attack was even more devastating than the physical damage. Santa Anna's carefully constructed defensive system, built around the natural strength of Cerro Gordo's position, collapsed in minutes as Mexican soldiers realized they were being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Officers shouted contradictory orders while their men scrambled to reposition themselves to face the unexpected threat from behind. The Battle of Cerro Gordo had truly begun, and the opening moves belonged entirely to the Americans. The plateau erupted in controlled chaos as American artillery crews worked with machine-like precision to reload their cannons. The surprise had been complete. Mexican soldiers below scrambled in panic as 12-pound iron shot crashed through their ranks from an impossible direction. Colonel Worth moved between his gun crews like a conductor leading a deadly orchestra, directing fire at the most critical targets while his men served their pieces with practiced efficiency. "Load canister! Target the battery on the left!" Worth shouted over the thunder of cannon fire. The American artillerists responded immediately, ramming home the deadly anti-personnel rounds that would turn their cannons into giant shotguns. When the guns roared again, hundreds of iron balls swept through the Mexican positions like a lethal hailstorm, silencing an entire artillery battery in seconds. Down in the valley, General Twiggs immediately recognized the signal for the main assault. The diversionary attack transformed into a genuine offensive as American infantry charged up the steep slopes with fixed bayonets, their battle cries echoing off the mountain walls. The Mexicans, caught between the flanking fire from above and the frontal assault from below, found their defensive positions untenable. Santa Anna, realizing the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him, attempted to rally his troops for a counterattack against the American position on the plateau. "Soldados! Defend Mexico!" the general shouted, personally leading a desperate charge up the rocky slopes toward Worth's artillery. For a moment, It appeared that Mexican valor might overcome American tactical superiority as hundreds of enemy soldiers advanced with remarkable courage despite the devastating fire they faced. Lieutenant Jackson, positioned with a company of infantry protecting the American guns, watched the Mexican counterattack develop with the cool, analytical mind that would later earn him fame as Stonewall. The young officer quickly realized that the enemy's desperate charge, while brave, was tactically futile. The steep terrain that had made the American ascent so difficult now worked against the attacking Mexicans, forcing them to advance uphill against prepared positions. "Steady, men. Let them come closer," Jackson commanded his soldiers, his calm voice carrying clearly despite the noise of battle. The American infantry held their fire until the Mexican assault reached point-blank range, then delivered a devastating volley that shattered the enemy charge. Santa Anna himself narrowly escaped death. His horse shot from under him as he retreated down the mountainside. According to battlefield reports compiled by war correspondents from major American newspapers, including detailed accounts published in the Baltimore Sun, the collapse of Mexican resistance was swift and complete once their counterattack failed. Demoralized soldiers began abandoning their positions in increasing numbers, many discarding their weapons as they fled toward the road leading back to Mexico City. The carefully constructed defensive system that had taken weeks to prepare disintegrated in less than 2 hours. The pursuit phase of the battle proved as decisive as the initial assault. American cavalry, held in reserve during the mountain fighting, now swept forward to exploit the Mexican collapse. Squadrons of mounted soldiers thundered down the mountain roads, cutting off retreat routes and capturing hundreds of prisoners who had thrown down their arms in surrender. The pursuit continued for miles, turning an already decisive victory into a complete rout of Santa Anna's army. By noon, the Battle of Cerro Gordo was effectively over. American flags flew from the rocky peaks that had seemed impregnable at dawn, and Mexican resistance had evaporated like morning mist. The road to Mexico City lay open, and Scott's campaign could continue its advance toward the enemy capital. What had begun as a potentially disastrous obstacle had been transformed into one of the most complete tactical victories in American military history. Captain Lee, whose reconnaissance had made the victory possible, surveyed the battlefield from his position on the plateau. The young engineer understood that he had witnessed something extraordinary, a perfect example of how intelligence, planning, and audacious execution could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The lessons learned at Cerro Gordo would influence American military thinking for decades to come. The aftermath of battle revealed both the completeness of American victory and the terrible human cost of 19th century warfare. Across the rocky slopes of Cerro Gordo, over 400 Mexican soldiers lay dead, their bodies scattered among the defensive positions they had died attempting to hold. American casualties were remarkably light by comparison, fewer than 60 killed and wounded, a testament to the tactical brilliance of Scott's flanking maneuver and the devastating effectiveness of surprise. General Santa Anna, despite his narrow escape from the battlefield, had lost far more than just another engagement. His reputation as Mexico's greatest military commander lay in ruins among the corpses of his soldiers. The Mexican general who had once captured the Alamo and defeated the Texans at Goliad now faced the humiliation of explaining how an impregnable mountain fortress had fallen to American audacity in less than 4 hours of fighting. The prisoners taken during the battle told a story of Mexican military organization stretched beyond its breaking point. Many of the captured soldiers were recent conscripts, peasants forced into service who possessed little training and less enthusiasm for fighting. Their officers, while personally brave, had proven unable to adapt quickly to the unexpected tactical situation created by the American flanking attack. The rigid military system inherited from Spanish colonial rule had shown itself incapable of responding effectively to American innovation and flexibility. Lieutenant Grant, walking among the battlefield debris, was struck by the youth of many Mexican casualties. Soldiers who looked barely old enough to carry a musket lay motionless among the rocks, their dreams of glory ended by iron shot and bayonet thrusts. The future president would later write about these moments, describing how battlefield victories that seemed glorious from a distance became sobering reminders of war's terrible cost when viewed up close. The material spoils of victory were impressive, by any standard. American forces captured over 3,000 muskets, 43 cannons, and enormous quantities of ammunition and supplies that Santa Anna's army had abandoned during their precipitous retreat. Most importantly, they had seized Santa Anna's personal baggage, including his ornate ceremonial leg, a prosthetic limb decorated with jewels and precious metals that became a coveted war trophy. As reported in contemporary accounts from the Army and Navy Chronicle, the strategic implications of the Cerro Gordo victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Scott's army now controlled the main road to Mexico City, effectively cutting off Mexican forces in the coastal regions from their supply bases in the interior. The psychological impact of the defeat would reverberate throughout Mexico, undermining confidence in Santa Anna's leadership and weakening resistance to American occupation. The engineering achievement represented by the battle could not be overstated. Moving artillery up treacherous mountain paths in complete darkness required technical skill and physical endurance that had rarely been demonstrated in military history. Captain Lee's reconnaissance and planning had provided the foundation, but the success of the operation depended on hundreds of soldiers who had risked their lives climbing through darkness with heavy equipment on their backs. The victory also revealed the growing sophistication of American military education and doctrine. Officers like Lee, Grant, and Jackson had been products of West Point's rigorous training program, which emphasized both theoretical knowledge and practical problem-solving skills. Their performance at Cerro Gordo demonstrated that the American military academy was producing officers capable of competing with their European counterparts on equal terms. Medical personnel worked throughout the day, treating wounded soldiers from both armies. American doctors, operating with limited supplies and primitive surgical techniques, saved many lives that would have been lost in earlier conflicts. The Mexican wounded received the same care as American casualties, a practice that reflected the professional military standards Scott had established for his army throughout the campaign. As evening fell over the Sierra Madre Oriental, the magnitude of the American achievement became clear to everyone who had participated in or witnessed the battle. The sun set over Cerro Gordo on April 18, 1847, illuminating an American flag that flew proudly from the mountain peak where Santa Anna had confidently planned his ambush just 24 hours earlier. General Scott stood among the captured Mexican artillery pieces, his weathered face reflecting both satisfaction at tactical success and understanding of the broader strategic implications of the day's events. The Battle of Cerro Gordo had accomplished far more than simply clearing a mountain pass. It had demonstrated to both Mexican defenders and American soldiers that superior tactics and innovative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible natural obstacles. The victory would resonate through military academies worldwide, studied as a textbook example of how intelligence gathering, careful planning, and audacious execution could achieve decisive results against superior defensive positions. Captain Lee, exhausted from 3 days of reconnaissance followed by the intensity of battle, found himself contemplating the lessons he had learned during the campaign. The young engineer understood that warfare was evolving rapidly, requiring officers who could think creatively rather than simply follow established doctrine. His experience at Cerro Gordo would influence his approach to military problems for the rest of his career, eventually making him one of the most innovative tactical commanders in American military history. For Lieutenant Grant, the battle provided insights into the importance of logistics and supply in modern warfare. Moving artillery up mountain paths had required extraordinary coordination between multiple units, and the success of the operation had depended as much on careful planning as on individual courage. These lessons would prove invaluable during his later campaigns in the Civil War, where similar attention to detail would enable him to sustain large armies across vast distances. Lieutenant Jackson had observed how disciplined troops could maintain their composure under the most challenging circumstances. The steady performance of American infantry during the Mexican counterattack had impressed the future Confederate general, reinforcing his belief that proper training and strong leadership could overcome numerical disadvantages. His own legendary steadiness at the First Battle of Bull Run would echo the calm professionalism he had witnessed among the soldiers defending Worth's artillery position. The Mexican perspective on the defeat was equally instructive. Santa Anna's inability to adapt quickly to unexpected tactical developments had transformed a strong defensive position into a death trap for his own soldiers. Mexican military culture, with its emphasis on hierarchy and rigid adherence to established procedures, had proven inadequate when faced with American innovation and flexibility. The contrast would influence military thinking throughout Latin America for generations to come. News of the victory spread rapidly throughout the United States, carried by telegraph lines and steamship routes that connected American cities with unprecedented speed. Newspaper accounts, as documented in archives from major publications including the New York Tribune and Philadelphia Inquirer, celebrated not only the tactical brilliance of the operation, but also the growing confidence of American arms in foreign conflicts. The victory at Cerro Gordo helped establish the United States as a serious military power capable of projecting force far from its own borders. The strategic path to Mexico City now lay open before Scott's army. Santa Anna's attempt to halt the American advance in the mountains had not only failed, but had actually weakened Mexican resistance by destroying one of their most experienced armies. The psychological impact of the defeat would make subsequent battles more difficult for Mexican commanders, who now faced troops who had lost confidence in their leadership and their cause. As the American army prepared to resume its march toward the Mexican capital, the officers and soldiers who had participated in the Battle of Cerro Gordo carried with them memories and lessons that would shape the future of American military doctrine. The mountain fortress that had seemed impregnable at dawn had fallen to American determination by sunset, proving once again that in warfare, as in all human endeavors, intelligence and courage could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The Battle of Cerro Gordo had ended, but its legacy would endure for generations, inspiring future American military commanders to seek victory through innovation rather than simple application of superior force.